Most people who have lived past 30 know this sensation. It arrives without warning. You wake, you move through the early minutes of a day, and somewhere between the kitchen and the door you notice that the world is presenting itself at a small, unaccountable distance. Colours are correct. Shapes are correct. Faces, when you see them, are the faces you expect. But the assembly of all these things into the seamless feeling of being here, that part is loosened. The seam is showing. The first instinct is to blame fatigue. The second is to blame mood. Both are reasonable, and both are usually wrong, or at least incomplete. What is happening is closer to a perceptual signal than a symptom, a brief, honest report from a system that almost never tells you it is working. And tonight, slowly, we are going to follow that signal down into where it actually comes from, not to solve it. Some of these questions are not the kind that close. If this is the sort of slow, serious thinking you came here for, you already know whether you want more of it. The subscribe button is there if it is, and that is the last time it will be mentioned. What we are about to do is take an experience nearly everyone has had, and almost no one examines carefully, and treat it as the small doorway it actually is. A doorway into how perception is built, into what consciousness might be, into a few of the questions that physics and philosophy have not yet been able to retire. The off feeling is not an interruption of reality. On certain mornings, it may be one of the more truthful things reality ever lets you notice. So we begin where the day begins. Not with grand claims, just with the light reading wrong in a room that has not changed. You are not seeing the room. You are seeing your brain's best guess at the room, corrected against incoming light a few times per second, and most of the time the guess is good enough that the correction never reaches awareness. This is not a metaphor. It is the working model in computational neuroscience, refined across the last 2 decades, and it inverts something almost everyone assumes about vision. The older intuition went roughly like this. Light enters the eye, signals travel up the optic nerve, the brain receives them, and somewhere in the visual cortex an image is assembled. Perception flows inward, the world arrives, and the mind receives it. The newer model, predictive processing, sometimes called active inference, describes something closer to the opposite direction. The brain is constantly generating a forecast of what the next moment of sensory input is likely to be. That forecast cascades downward through the visual hierarchy before the photons even arrive. What actually travels upward from the retina is mostly the difference between the forecast and the reality. The error signal, not the picture. If you find that strange, hold the strangeness for a moment. It means that what you experience as seeing is closer to a controlled hallucination than to a recording. The hallucination just happens to be tightly leashed to incoming data, most of the time by an error correction process running below awareness. Andy Clark, who has done some of the careful philosophical work around this, has used the phrase the brain as a prediction engine. Carl Friston, whose mathematics undergird much of the model, would push it further and say the brain is not only predicting, it is actively trying to minimize surprise across the entire system by any means available, including changing what you look at, where you move, what you attend to. There are good reasons evolution might have built perception this way. Forecasting is fast. Reception is slow. By the time raw sensory data has been fully processed, the moment it described is already gone. A predictive system can act in something closer to real time, because most of the work was done before the data arrived. The cost is that perception becomes, in a precise sense, a kind of disciplined fiction, accurate but constructed. This matters for the off-day question, and we will return to it. Because if what you call seeing is really a forecast continuously matched against an error stream, then the feeling of stability you usually have is not given to you by the world. It is produced, and anything that is produced can, on rare days, be produced slightly differently. For now, just notice this much. The brain behind your eyes is not a passive receiver. It is an organ that spends most of its energy guessing, and most of its corrections never reach you. The room you walk through every morning has been forecast before you entered it. The forecast is usually right. When it is slightly wrong, and the wrongness reaches awareness, that is one of the places we are going. Think about what it would cost, computationally and biologically, to feel the world freshly each second, every shadow registered as new, every familiar object reassessed from scratch, every footstep evaluated as if you had never walked before. The mind would never finish processing one moment before the next arrived. The organism would not survive long enough to reproduce. The evolutionary pressure on perception was therefore not toward accuracy in any pure sense. It was toward usable stability, a representation of the world coherent enough to act inside, fast enough to not get you killed, and cheap enough in metabolic cost that you could still hunt, eat, reason, and pair bond. That balance is more delicate than it sounds. The brain consumes around 20% of the body's energy budget, while making up roughly 2% of its mass. Vision alone is enormously expensive. If perception had to rebuild itself fully each instant, the cost would be untenable. So it doesn't. Instead, it leans on what neuroscientists sometimes call the prior, the accumulated expectation about what this room, this hour, this body usually feels like, and only updates the parts of the prior that the incoming error signal demands. What you experience as the steady realness of things is therefore not a property of things. It is a property of how cheaply your brain is able to reuse yesterday's model of them. When the model is reusable, the world feels solid. When too much of it has to be rebuilt at once, the world begins to feel less anchored, even if nothing visible has changed. There is a useful way to put this. Stability is metabolic. It costs less to feel that the world is normal than it costs to feel that the world is strange. Strangeness, neurologically, is expensive. The brain works to suppress it, not because strangeness is dangerous in itself, but because the prediction machinery has been tuned for millennia to favor the cheaper interpretation whenever the data permits. This has implications most people never quite reckon with. The smoothness of ordinary experience is not a neutral default, it is the result of active suppression, a constant low-level filtering out of the small mismatches between what was forecast and what arrived. You are not seeing the world clearly. You are seeing the world after a great deal of small disagreement has been quietly reconciled in your favor. Most of the time this works in your interest. You can drive a car, hold a conversation, navigate a stairwell. None of these would be possible if every footstep felt like a first encounter. The cost of stability is paid in advance, in the form of a brain that has decided, before you wake, what most of today is going to be. But the system is not perfect. There are days, and this is the hinge of what we are going to explore, when the metabolic balance shifts, when the cost of suppression rises slightly, when the prior, for any of 100 reasons, is not quite as easily reusable as usual. On those days, the small disagreements are not fully filtered. The seam shows, and the seam, when it shows, is informative. Not because something has gone wrong, because something that was always there has briefly become visible. What you feel on an off day is, in part, the cost of stability, the cost that is normally paid silently behind the curtain of ordinary perception. The curtain has not torn, it has only thinned, and through the thinning, you are seeing a small piece of the machinery that builds the room you wake up in. That machinery is not yours alone. It is the same machinery that builds every conscious creature's world. We are going to keep narrowing in on it, not because the machinery explains everything, because the places it cannot explain are where the more interesting questions actually live. Pay attention to the half second after you reach for a cup that is heavier than you expected. There is a tiny pause inside it. Your hand closes around the handle, your arm begins the lift, and for a fraction of a second the body recalibrates, wrist firms, shoulder adjusts, the motion completes. Most people never notice the pause, but it is real, it is measurable, and it is one of the cleanest examples of the threshold we are about to look at. Inside that pause, a number was calculated. Neuroscientists call it prediction error. It is, at its simplest, the difference between what the brain expected the cup to weigh and what the cup actually weighed. The error signal traveled upward, the prior was updated, and the next time you lift that cup, the forecast will be slightly more accurate. This is happening, in some form, in nearly every sensory and motor system you have, thousands of times per minute, far below the threshold where you would ever notice. The threshold is what matters tonight. There is a level of mismatch that the system absorbs silently. The cup that weighs 10 grams more than expected. The door that opens with a slightly different resistance. the voice that arrives at a slightly unfamiliar pitch. These small disagreements are reconciled without ever reaching consciousness. You experience the lift, the door, the voice, as if there had been no disagreement at all. Above that threshold, something different happens. The mismatch is large enough, or sustained enough, that the suppression cost exceeds the cost of letting the error through. The signal arrives in awareness. You notice that something is off, not because the world has become strange, but because a normally invisible reconciliation has briefly failed to complete in time. This is, in a precise sense, where the off feeling technically lives, not in any single perception, in the gap between forecast and update, in the moment where the gap is wide enough that consciousness gets briefly involved in a process it usually has no business knowing about. Researchers have begun to map this gap with surprising precision. Studies using EEG and fMRI have identified specific signatures of prediction error at different cortical levels. The error in a low-level visual area looks different from the error in a higher-level conceptual one. A face that doesn't match the expected face, a room that doesn't match the expected room, a self that doesn't match the expected self. Each of these can be measured, at least in principle, as an error signal at a particular layer of the predictive hierarchy. What this means is that the vague phrase "things feel off" is not vague at the level of brain function. It is a real event with a real location in the architecture. Different off feelings arise from different layers. A persistent low-level visual mismatch will feel different from a high-level identity mismatch, even if both come down to the same underlying mechanism. We will return to this distinction. It matters because the deeper layers, the ones closest to your sense of self, your sense of time, your sense of the world being the world, are also the ones whose errors are most likely to be experienced as something almost philosophical. A high-level prediction error doesn't feel like a heavy cup. It feels like a question. That is the threshold we are crossing. What is a self trying to do? Mathematically, if you reduce it to its simplest possible description, that is roughly the question Carl Friston has spent the last 2 decades trying to answer. And the answer he has proposed has become one of the most ambitious and most contested frameworks in contemporary neuroscience. It is called the free energy principle. It is not, despite the name, a theory about thermodynamics in the usual sense. It is a proposal about what any self-organizing system, a cell, a brain, possibly a society, is doing in order to remain itself across time. The proposal goes something like this. A living system, by definition, persists. It does not dissolve into the noise of its environment. To persist, it must maintain a relatively stable set of internal states despite a chaotic and unpredictable world. From an information theoretic standpoint, this means the system must keep its sensory inputs within a manageable range, must in effect minimize surprise, where surprise has a precise mathematical definition involving the probability of the inputs the system actually receives. Free energy in Friston's formalism is an upper bound on this surprise. Minimize free energy and you minimize the surprise indirectly by keeping the gap between what the system predicts and what it actually encounters as small as possible. That sounds abstract. It has concrete consequences. Under the free energy principle, the brain is not just predicting the world, it is acting in the world specifically to make the world conform to its predictions. You move your eyes to look at the thing you expected to see. You walk into the room you expected to enter. You construct a life, relationships, habits, environments, partly so that the world keeps producing the inputs your model is good at handling. The self, on this view, is something close to the behavioral signature of a system trying to keep its predictions accurate by reshaping its surroundings to match them. This is a beautiful idea. It is also, depending on whom you ask, either the most important framework in cognitive science or a piece of mathematical elegance whose empirical reach has been overstated. Working scientists are genuinely divided. Some, like Anil Seth and Andy Clark, have built careful, useful interpretations of predictive processing and active inference that connect to specific experimental findings. Others have raised pointed questions about whether the free energy principle, in its full form, is actually testable, whether it makes predictions that could in principle be falsified. or whether it is a kind of conceptual scaffolding that fits anything you point it at. That debate is not settled. It is worth knowing that it is not settled, because a great deal of popular writing about predictive processing presents it as established fact. It is more accurate to say that predictive processing as a general orientation is well supported, that active inference as a model of perception and action is taken seriously by many researchers, and that the free energy principle as a unified theory of life and mind remains a live, ambitious, and not yet resolved proposal. What it gives us, even tentatively, is a way of thinking about why an off day is not a failure of the system, but a moment when the system's project becomes briefly visible. If the self is trying all the time to keep the world matching its forecast, and if that effort is normally invisible because it is mostly successful, then what you feel on certain mornings is not the system breaking, it is the system being seen faintly, doing what it always does. There is a strange dignity in that thought. The off feeling is not a flaw in the apparatus. It is the apparatus glimpsed at work, a self in the act of being a self. Whether Friston's mathematics ultimately turns out to describe the deepest level of that work, or whether something better will replace it in the next decades, the underlying intuition has already changed how serious people think about minds. We are not, on this view, observers of a world. We are systems whose continued existence depends on keeping the world close enough to our model of it, that we can stay alive inside our own predictions. When the gap widens, we notice. We were never not noticing. We just usually had nothing to notice. Illness will do it. The first day of a flu, before the symptoms have organized themselves into anything you would call sickness, often arrives as a vague wrongness in the room, a sense that the kitchen is somehow further from the bedroom than it was yesterday, that the kettle is heavier, that the voices on the radio are talking slightly past you rather than to you. The body has begun reallocating resources. The prediction system which depends on those resources is running on slightly less. The forecast slips. Jet lag does something similar, by a different route. A 10-hour flight scrambles the circadian inputs the brain uses to time its predictions. The internal model that says this is morning light, this is the hour my hands feel awake, is suddenly out of phase with the light actually arriving. For 2 or 3 days the world reads slightly translated, as if you were watching a film with audio dubbed a frame late. Most travelers describe this as fatigue. It is closer to a synchronization error in the predictive machinery. Grief is the deepest version. A bereaved person frequently reports that the world itself looks different in the weeks after a death. Colors duller, voices flatter, distances longer. Nothing has actually changed in the world. What has changed is the prior. The whole set of expectations about who would be in the room, who would speak next, whose shoes would be by the door, has collapsed all at once. The forecast that organized ordinary life is no longer accurate, and rebuilding it is slow, painful, and not a process you can hurry. The strangeness of the world during grief is, in part, the strangeness of perception running against an outdated model. Certain medications produce the effect chemically, anesthesia recovery, some antidepressants in their first weeks, dissociatives at low doses, even ordinary antihistamines for sensitive people. All can introduce a measurable thinning between what the brain forecasts and what it can quickly correct against. The reports are remarkably consistent. The room feels rendered. The self feels narrated. Other people feel a half step removed. Sleep deprivation is its own case. Past about 30 hours awake, prediction error handling begins to degrade in measurable ways. The seam between forecast and update widens. People in this state often describe ordinary objects as faintly unreal, faces as faintly unfamiliar, their own hands as belonging to someone almost themselves. None of these are pathologies in the strict sense. They are conditions in which a normally hidden process becomes briefly observable. The list could be longer: high altitude, dehydration, prolonged stillness, the second hour of a long meditation, the moment after intense exercise when the heart is still loud, but the pattern is the same. The machinery is not broken. The machinery is running with slightly less of what it usually has, and the result is a small, honest report from a system that almost never reports on itself. This is worth taking seriously because it reframes what an off day is. It is not a malfunction, it is a window. Something has shifted just enough that you can see for a few hours what the brain ordinarily does for free. The chapter that follows turns from the machinery itself to the layer that notices the machinery as faltering, because the prediction system can slip without your knowing. What makes the off feeling possible at all is a quieter, stranger faculty, the part of the mind that is watching the watching. There is a layer of you that knows you are thinking. It is not the thinking itself, it is the part that, right now, can notice the sentence forming in your mind, can observe that you have been listening for several minutes, can flag that your attention drifted briefly towards something else and has now returned. It does not generate thoughts, it registers them, and on most days it runs so quietly that almost no one notices it at all. Cognitive scientists call this metacognition, and it is one of the more curious faculties the human mind possesses. First-order cognition is the ordinary content of awareness, the perception of the room, the memory of yesterday, the calculation of an hour from now. Metacognition is the second-order monitor that tracks the quality of those processes. It is the faculty that lets you know whether you are remembering accurately, whether you understand what you are reading, whether the perception you are having seems trustworthy. Most of the time, the metacognitive layer agrees quietly with the first-order layer. You see a chair, and the monitor concurs that yes, this is a chair, and the perception is fine. You remember a name, and the monitor confirms that the memory feels solid. The monitor is so smoothly integrated with the perception itself that you do not experience them as separate, but they are separate. And on certain days they come apart in small, telling ways. The off feeling we are tracing is, in a precise sense, a metacognitive event. The first-order perception is fine. The chair is still a chair, the room still a room, the face of the person across from you still recognizably their face. What has changed is that the monitor, the layer that usually says, quietly, yes, this is real, this is here, this is yours, has begun to file a small complaint. It is not telling you the perception is wrong, it is telling you that something about the way the perception is being delivered does not feel quite trustworthy. This is informative because the metacognitive layer is not a luxury feature, it is critical. Without it, you would have no way of knowing that you might be mistaken. You would have no way of catching your own confabulations, your own misremembering, your own perceptual errors. A person whose metacognition is impaired through certain strokes, certain forms of dementia, certain drug states, does not realize they are confused. The confusion feels like ordinary clarity, because the layer that would have noticed has gone silent. So the fact that you can notice an off day at all is itself a sign of something working. The monitor is doing its job. It is reporting that the prediction machinery this morning is delivering the world with a slightly different texture than usual. What makes the report so disquieting is that the monitor cannot tell you why. It can only tell you that. The diagnostic ends with the flag. The interpretation is left to you, which is partly why off days feel philosophical even when their causes are mundane. There is a second strangeness here, worth holding for a moment. The monitor does not only watch the perceptions, it watches itself. There is a part of you, right now, aware that the previous sentence is being attended to. That recursion, the watcher of the watcher, does not seem to terminate at any clear flaw. Whether it ever does, whether there is a final layer beneath which no further watching happens, is a question we will not answer tonight. It is one of the open questions in consciousness research, and people who say otherwise are usually selling something. What we can say is that this layer, fragile as it is what makes the off day possible to notice. Without it, the strangeness would simply be the day. With it, the strangeness becomes a signal, and signals, attended carefully, are how you find out what the system is actually doing. The clinical literature has a name for the most pronounced version of what we are describing: derealization. It appears in diagnostic manuals as a feature of various dissociative disorders, anxiety conditions, and certain neurological events. The textbook description is recognizable, a sense that the world has become unreal, dreamlike, watched through glass, mechanically rendered. Patients describe it with surprising consistency across cultures and decades. What the textbooks have historically been less clear about is that mild derealization is not rare and not necessarily pathological. Surveys of non-clinical populations, repeated several times over the last 20 years, have found that a significant majority of adults report at least one episode of derealization in their lifetime, and that perhaps a quarter to a third experience it occasionally without any associated disorder. The episodes are often brief, minutes to hours. They are often triggered by ordinary stressors. They resolve without intervention. They do not in most cases indicate that anything is wrong. This places derealization on a continuum, not in a category. At one end, the pronounced clinical form, persistent and distressing, associated with diagnosable conditions and warranting care. At the other end, the brief and barely articulable off day, which most people pass through without naming. In between, a wide gradient of experience that ordinary adult life produces with some regularity and that almost no one talks about, partly because the language for it is awkward, and partly because describing it tends to make people sound stranger than they are. Cognitive neuroscience has begun to ask what mild derealization actually is, and the picture that has emerged is consistent with the predictive framework we have been building. Several research groups, working independently, have proposed that derealization involves a specific kind of disturbance in the integration between bodily signals, interoception, the sense of the internal state of the body, and the high-level model of the world. When the integration weakens, the world is still perceived accurately, but the felt sense of it being one's own world, encountered from inside one's own body, is reduced. The result is the characteristic glassy quality of the experience. This proposal is still being refined. It is not a settled account, but it has the advantage of explaining why derealization tends to arise in conditions that disturb interoception, high anxiety, exhaustion, dehydration, certain hormonal states, intense focus on cognitive tasks that pull attention away from the body for long stretches. Each of these alters the body signal that ordinarily anchors the world's realness, and each of them predictably can produce the thinning we have been describing. What this means practically is that the off feeling is not a sign of the mind beginning to fail. It is more often a sign of a temporary mismatch between two systems that usually work in tight coordination: the system that perceives the world, and the system that tells you the world is being perceived by you, here, in this body, now. When those two get briefly out of phase, the world remains visible but the inhabiting of it loosens. Most people, encountering this for the first time, find it alarming. The alarm itself is part of the loop. Anxiety about derealization tends to deepen derealization, because anxiety further disturbs interoception. The condition feeds itself if it is mistaken for danger. It often resolves more quickly when it is recognized as what it actually is: a passing decoupling, not a deterioration. There is a wider implication here, which the next section will start to draw out. If the realness of the world is something the body confers, then realness is not a property of the world at all. It is a feeling, generated somewhere, attached to perception by a process that can falter. And a feeling that can falter is a feeling that has a mechanism. A mechanism is something we can ask about. What is it that gives a real chair its quality of being real, while a vividly imagined chair, no matter how detailed, lacks that quality? The chair you are sitting on, or the chair across the room, has a kind of weight in awareness that no mental image quite reproduces. You can picture a chair perfectly and still not mistake the picture for the thing. The difference is not in the picture's clarity, it is in something else, something the picture does not have. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio spent much of his career arguing that this something is, in part, a bodily phenomenon. Real perceptions, on his account, arrive accompanied by a faint somatic signature, a subtle pattern of bodily response that imagined perceptions do not generate. The chair across the room slightly changes your posture, your breath, your attentional readiness, in a way the imagined chair does not. The body, on Damasio's view, marks experiences as real by responding to them. He called these markers somatic markers, and while the original theory was developed in the context of decision-making, the broader principle has informed a generation of work on how feelings and perceptions intertwine. More recent research has pushed the idea further. Some philosophers and cognitive scientists have proposed that the brain produces a distinct cognitive output, sometimes called the feeling of presence, sometimes the feeling of reality, sometimes the realness signal, that is computed separately from the perception itself and then attached to it. The signal can be thought of as the brain's confidence that what is being perceived corresponds to something actually present, here, now, in the same world the perceiver inhabits. If this is right, and it is one proposal among several, then realness is not a feature of perception. It is a feature attached to perception by a process that has its own machinery and its own potential for failure. A perception with the realness signal turned on feels real. A perception with the signal weakened or absent feels detached, watched, dreamlike, even if the perception itself is otherwise intact. This would explain a great deal about derealization, about lucid dreaming, about certain meditative states, and about the off day. What the proposal does not explain, and it is honest to acknowledge this, is why there should be such a signal at all. From a strictly functional standpoint, you do not need a feeling of realness in order to act in the world. You need accurate perception and useful predictions. The additional feeling, the texture of being here now, is a kind of bonus that consciousness apparently insists on adding. Why it adds it and how are not currently understood. Some of the deepest open questions in the philosophy of mind sit near this point, and we will reach them shortly. For now, the relevant observation is simpler. On an ordinary day, the realness signal is robust. The room feels real because the signal is firing strongly and steadily, attaching itself to every perception as it arrives. On an off day, the signal is weaker or noisier or briefly intermittent. The perceptions are unchanged. What has changed is the texture wrapped around them. This is why the off feeling is so hard to describe to someone who has not had it. There is nothing visibly wrong. Nothing has moved, nothing has shifted in the room, but the room is being delivered to you without the small constant assurance that usually rides alongside it. The assurance was always invisible. You only notice it when it is briefly absent. There is one more thing worth saying about this, and it concerns trust. The realness signal is one of the most intimate things your brain produces. You trust it more than you trust any belief, any memory, any argument. You walk through your life on the assumption that what feels real is real, and most of the time this assumption is sound. The off day raises, very faintly, the question of what the world would look like if the assumption were not always sound, of how much of your sense of what is real depends on a signal you cannot directly see, generated by a mechanism you do not control. The faintness of that question is part of why the off day disquiets. A loud question would be easier to dismiss. A faint one keeps returning. There is a moment that some people experience occasionally, more often in their 20s and 30s, that runs in the opposite direction of déjà vu. It does not have the popular name déjà vu has. The technical term is jamais vu, already French, already a little awkward, and it describes the experience of looking at something entirely familiar and feeling that it is somehow not. A common word, written or repeated, that suddenly looks like a meaningless arrangement of letters, a long-known face that briefly does not register as anyone in particular, the hand at the end of your wrist seen as if for the first time, with a strangeness that has no content, familiar things stripped of familiarity. Jamais vu is far less discussed than its better-known sibling, and considerably more disquieting when it happens at scale. Brief flickers are common. Sustained episodes, even of only a minute or two, can produce a small panic that has more to do with the unfamiliarity itself than with anything in the perception. What jamais vu reveals when you sit with it is that recognition is its own faculty, separable from perception, separable from memory in the ordinary sense. You do not perceive a face and then look up its identity in some mental file. You perceive a face that arrives already labeled, already wrapped in a sense of who this is, what your relationship to them is, how you should feel about seeing them. The labeling is so fast and so reliable that you experience it as part of the seeing. You do not notice that there was ever any distinction between perceiving and recognizing, but there is. Neurological case studies have shown, sometimes painfully, that the two can dissociate. Patients with certain forms of damage to specific temporal regions can perceive faces with full visual clarity and yet not recognize them, including, in some cases, the faces of spouses and children. The perception is intact. The recognition signal has gone silent. Most affecting, in some cases the patient knows the face should be familiar, can reason their way to who it must be, and yet does not feel the familiarity. The reasoning produces the answer. The recognition does not produce the feeling. This is the inverse of jamais vu, in a sense. In jamais vu, the recognition signal flickers off briefly in a healthy person. In the neurological condition, it is impaired more durably by a structural cause. Both reveal the same underlying fact. There is a recognition system, distinct from perception, that does most of its work invisibly, and that, when it falters, does not announce its failure with any obvious symptom. Perception continues, the world looks the same. The signal that says this belongs here, this is yours, this is known simply stops arriving. The off day can include faint versions of this. Not full jamais vu, most off days are milder. Just a small reduction in the recognition signal as it attaches to ordinary objects and people. The kitchen looks like itself, but it does not feel quite as much yours. The face of a partner is the face of a partner, but the warmth of recognition arrives a half-beat late, or thinner than usual. Nothing has been forgotten. The signal is just slightly down. What makes recognition so philosophically interesting is that we still do not fully understand what it is. Recognition involves memory, but it is not memory. It involves perception, but it is not perception. It involves something like a confidence judgment. This stimulus matches a known pattern with this much certainty, but the conscious experience of recognition is not a felt judgment. It is closer to a tone, a coloring, a quiet endorsement laid over the perception. The genuinely unresolved question is whether there is one recognition system or several, and whether they all share a final common pathway in the brain. Different lines of evidence point different ways. Some researchers, working with face recognition specifically, argue for a relatively localized system. Others, working with object and word recognition, argue for distributed networks that recombine for different categories of stimulus. There is no consensus, and likely will not be one for some time. What is consistent across the disagreement is that recognition is not given to us by the world. It is something the brain does, and like any process the brain does, it can have a quieter day. When it does, the world remains present and accurate, but slightly less yours. That smallness is enough to register as wrongness, even when nothing is wrong. Hormone cycle. Neurotransmitters fluctuate. Sleep architecture varies night to night. Cortisol curves bend differently after a stressful week than after a restful one. The gut microbiome shifts within hours of a different meal. Body temperature traces a slightly different arc. Immune activity rises and falls in response to exposures you never noticed. All of this is happening continuously. All of it is feeding into the brain, and all of it is shaping the prediction system uses to construct the world this morning. You do not wake up as the same physical organism you were yesterday. You wake up as a closely related organism, similar enough that the continuity of selfhood is preserved, different enough that the prediction system is working with a slightly retuned set of inputs. Most of the difference is invisible. Some days, a small fraction of it shows. This is one of the more underappreciated facts about ordinary experience. People speak of themselves as if they were fixed points moving through changing days. The biology runs the other way round. The days are relatively similar, the same room, the same light, the same hour of waking, and the self moving through them is what is changing. The variability is internal. The world is the steady term in the equation. Most of the time the changes cancel out, or stay below the threshold where they affect anything you would notice. Across a healthy week, the system rebuilds the experience of being yourself with enough fidelity that the identity feels seamless. The continuity of consciousness from one day to the next is not given. It is reconstructed every morning from a body that was different last night and is different again now. When a day reads off, one common reason is simply that the reconstruction this morning had to use slightly different materials. A poor night of sleep restricts the consolidation processes that knit together the previous day's experiences into stable memory. A subclinical infection raises inflammation, which alters mood and perception in measurable ways. A small shift in hormonal state, well within normal range, can change how vivid colors appear, how loud sounds register, how present other people feel. The prior the brain reaches for is the same prior in name. In content, it is a slightly different prior than the one it reached for yesterday. There is something quietly humbling about this, if you let yourself sit with it. The continuity of the self is not a given fact. It is an achievement, repeated daily, by a body that does not consult you about how it intends to do the work. On most days, the achievement is so successful that you mistake it for a property. On some days, it is less successful, and you notice that it was always a process. This is not a frightening observation, though it can feel that way at first. It is closer to the recognition that a long marriage is not a static condition, but a daily reweaving, that the person you are with today is not exactly the person you were with last year, and that the relationship's continuity is something the two of you keep producing together without remarking on it. The self is in a similar relationship with itself. When the reweaving falters even slightly, the day reads off, and the off feeling in its quieter forms may be one of the most honest things the body ever tells you about what it has been doing the rest of the time. The next chapter takes us out beyond the body's machinery, into the wider questions that the off day, at its strangest, can open. Questions that some of the most careful thinkers of the last 100 years have not been able to put down. You can read every paper ever written on neural correlates of consciousness, learn every detail of the predictive architecture, master the chemistry of every neurotransmitter, and the connectivity of every cortical region, and at the end of all of it, you still will not have answered the question of why any of that machinery should produce an experience at all. Why there is something it is like to be you, rather than nothing, is not a question the science has so far been able to touch. This is what David Chalmers in 1995 named the hard problem of consciousness. The name has stuck because the problem has stuck. The easy problems, how the brain processes information, how it integrates senses, how it generates behavior, are easy not because they are simple, but because we know in principle how to attack them. The hard problem is hard because no one has yet proposed a fully convincing account of how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, and no one is sure what such an account would even look like. Most people who follow this debate know it as a topic for philosophy seminars. Few realize that it surfaces very faintly on ordinary off days. The off feeling involves, among other things, a brief loosening of the integration between the perceptions and the experience of having them. You see the room, but the seeing feels slightly less inhabited than usual. The seeing has not stopped. The having has thinned. In that thinning, the hard problem is briefly visible, not as a question on a page, but as an experiential gap. The perceptual machinery is doing what it does, and the question of why the machinery's output is accompanied by experience at all becomes, for a moment, less abstract. You can almost feel the place where the explanation breaks. It is worth being clear about what is and is not contested here. It is not contested that brains produce minds in some sense. The correlation between brain states and conscious states is overwhelming. Damage to specific brain regions produces specific changes in experience. Drugs that act on specific receptors produce specific alterations in awareness. The dependency is real and well established. What is contested, genuinely contested by serious thinkers in good faith on both sides, is whether the correlation will eventually be explained reductively, the way other natural phenomena have been explained, or whether something else is going on that we do not yet have the conceptual equipment to articulate. Some philosophers and scientists hold that consciousness will eventually be explained by a sufficiently sophisticated account of physical processes. Others hold that no purely physical account can do it, because the very thing that needs explaining, subjective experience itself, is not the kind of thing that physical descriptions are designed to capture. Still others propose that consciousness might be more fundamental than we have assumed, and that the hard problem dissolves only when we revise our basic physical ontology to make room for it. We will look at one of those proposals later in this chapter. What matters tonight is that none of these positions has won. The literature is rich, the arguments are sharp, and the question remains open after several decades of intense work. Anyone who tells you the hard problem has been solved is overstating either their evidence or their humility. The off day, faintly, makes the openness palpable. You are not solving the hard problem on an off day. You are catching a small whiff of it. The machinery you spent your life inside is for a few hours slightly less invisible. And the question of what the machinery is for and why its output is accompanied by anyone at all comes a half step closer than usual. It does not arrive with answers, but it arrives, and that arrival, uninvited, is worth taking seriously rather than waving away. The phrase "the observer collapses the wave function" has done more damage to popular understanding of physics than almost any other piece of borrowed terminology. It suggests that human consciousness has a special role in determining physical reality, and it has been used to support an enormous amount of speculation that working physicists, on the whole, do not endorse. The actual situation is both stranger and more sober. Quantum mechanics is the most accurately tested theory in the history of science. Its predictions match experiment to many decimal places. What is not settled, and has not been settled in nearly a century of trying, is what the mathematics of the theory is actually describing. This is the measurement problem. The equations evolve smoothly until a measurement is made, at which point something different happens, and physicists do not agree about what that something is. The Copenhagen interpretation, the rough orthodoxy of the mid-20th century, treats the wave function as a tool for predicting measurement outcomes and largely declines to say what it represents in itself. Many physicists working today operate under a pragmatic version of this position, sometimes called "shut up and calculate," because the predictions work and the philosophical questions can be set aside. The many worlds interpretation, developed by Hugh Everett and refined since, proposes that no collapse actually occurs, that all possible outcomes happen in branching realities that decohere from one another. There is no special role for an observer. There is only a wave function that never collapses and a universe that splits. Cubism, a more recent proposal, treats quantum probabilities as expressions of the beliefs of a particular agent, not as features of an observer-independent world. The observer is central, but not in a mystical sense. The theory is about what specific agents can predict, given what they know. Pilot wave theory, objective collapse models, relational quantum mechanics. There are several other serious proposals, each with respected physicists defending them, each with technical strengths and weaknesses, and none currently capable of being decisively distinguished by experiment. What this means is that the role of measurement in quantum theory is genuinely unresolved at the level of interpretation. The role of consciousness, specifically, is more contested still. Most physicists do not think consciousness plays any special role in quantum mechanics. A few, Eugene Wigner once, Henry Stapp, a small number of contemporary thinkers have argued that it might. The argument has not won broad assent, and treating it as established is not honest. What is honest is to say that the deepest question quantum mechanics raises about reality has not been answered, that the answer matters for what we mean when we say something is real, and that the off-day in its strangeness sits closer to this open territory than most people realize. When you wake into a morning that does not feel quite real, you are not having a quantum experience in any technical sense, but you are having an experience that brushes against the same large, unanswered questions about what the relationship is between observation and the observed, questions that physics, for all its precision, has not yet resolved. The brushing is faint. It does not justify large claims. It does justify a certain humility about how settled our picture of reality actually is. Some perceptions are useful precisely because they are not accurate. The friendly icon on a computer desktop bears almost no resemblance to the magnetic and electrical structures it lets you manipulate. You move a small picture of a folder, and somewhere underneath, voltages shift in patterns no human eye could pass. The icon is not a lie. It is an interface, a simplified handle for interacting with something whose real structure would be useless to see. Donald Hoffman, A cognitive scientist at the University of California, Irvine, has spent the last 2 decades developing the argument that perception in general works this way. His view, which he calls the interface theory of perception, holds that natural selection did not optimize our senses for accuracy. It optimized them for what he calls fitness payoffs, for delivering whatever simplified, action-guiding information would best help our ancestors survive and reproduce. On this account, what we see is not the world. What we see is a desktop, a species-specific interface that hides reality's underlying structure, because that structure would be more confusing than useful. To make the case, Hoffman has run formal evolutionary game-theoretic simulations comparing organisms that perceive truthfully against organisms that perceive only what helps them survive. In his simulations, the truth-seers are reliably outcompeted. The conclusion he draws is bold, not just that some perceptions are inaccurate, but that perception as such has been shaped to be a useful simplification, with no special pressure toward correspondence with whatever reality actually is. This is more radical than predictive processing, and it is important to mark the difference. Predictive processing says the brain constructs perception by combining priors with sensory data, but it generally assumes that the constructed perception correlates, however imperfectly, with the actual structure of the world. Hoffman is saying something stronger, that perception's relationship to the world might be more like an icon's relationship to the underlying voltages, functional, action-guiding, but not at all the same kind of thing as what it represents. The view has serious critics. Anil Seth, among others, has argued that Hoffman's simulations rely on assumptions that do not generalize, and that real-world perception, while constructed, is constrained by data in ways the interface metaphor underplays. Other philosophers have pushed back on the move from perception is selected for fitness to perception bears no resemblance to reality. Selection for fitness, the argument goes, is not in tension with selection for accuracy in cases where accuracy is useful, and accuracy often is useful. A perception that bore no resemblance to its causes would be less, not more, fit. The debate is ongoing, and it is worth following carefully. Hoffman's strongest claim, that space-time itself is an interface, and that a deeper reality, whatever it is not located in space or time as we perceive them, goes well beyond what the empirical work supports, and he himself acknowledges this is a speculative extension. The more modest version, that perception is more constructed and less truth-tracking than common sense assumes, has more support, and aligns with much of what the predictive framework already implies. What the interface theory adds, even at its most modest, is a particular flavor of unsettlement. If your perception of the world is more like a useful summary than a faithful image, then the off-days hint that the summary is being delivered slightly differently is not just a glitch. It is a reminder that you have been working from a summary all along. People who hear this for the first time often try to refute it by pointing to the obvious functioning of perception. You can catch a ball, you can read a face, you can drive a car. The senses must be tracking something real. This response is not wrong, but it does not actually engage the claim. The interface theory does not deny that perception works. It denies that working requires faithful representation. A desktop icon works exactly because it does not look like the underlying voltages. The point is not that perception is broken. The point is that working and representing are not the same thing, and that we have been quietly conflating them. Whether Hoffman is right in the strong form, the weak form, or some intermediate form, the discussion has reopened a question many philosophers thought was closed. The question is not whether the world exists. It is what the relationship is between the world and the experience the world produces in conscious creatures. That question is alive again, and it does not have a clean answer. The texture of certain mornings is hard to describe, except by reaching for the word rendered. Not unreal, not dreamlike. Rendered, as if the surfaces had been generated rather than encountered, as if the depth of the room were being computed rather than simply being there. Most people who have had this sensation eventually think of the simulation hypothesis, even if they have never read a word of philosophy on the subject. The thought arrives because the experience invites it. The simulation hypothesis has been crudely flattened by its passage through popular culture. The version most people know, that we might be living in a video game run by advanced beings, is closer to a science fiction premise than to the actual argument. The actual argument, formulated by the philosopher Nick Bostrom in a 2003 paper, is more careful and more interesting. Bostrom's argument is not that we are in a simulation, it is that one of three propositions must be true. Either advanced civilizations almost never reach the stage of running large numbers of detailed ancestor simulations, perhaps because they go extinct first, or because they lose interest, or because such simulations are technically impossible, or such civilizations reach that stage but choose, for whatever reason, not to run them. Or, if neither of the first two holds, then the number of simulated minds vastly exceeds the number of unsimulated ones, and we should, by simple statistical reasoning, be more likely to be among the simulated. The argument is a trilemma, not a conclusion. It does not claim to know which of the three is the case. What it claims is that one of them must be, given certain assumptions about the trajectory of intelligent civilizations and the nature of conscious experience. Each of those assumptions is itself debatable, and serious philosophers have pushed on them from multiple angles. There are good reasons to think the argument is less decisive than its popularizers suggest. The assumption that consciousness can be substrate independent, that a sufficiently detailed simulation of a brain would actually be conscious, is not obvious. The hard problem of consciousness, which we touched a moment ago, is directly relevant here. If consciousness depends on something specific to biological matter, or on something we have not yet identified at all, then ancestor simulations might run in great numbers without containing any minds. The statistical conclusion would not follow. The assumption that any advanced civilization would want to run many such simulations is also contestable. So is the assumption that the computational resources required would be available. What the argument does, even at its most cautious, is force a particular kind of intellectual honesty. It shows that you cannot consistently believe A. that consciousness is substrate independent, B. that civilizations like ours sometimes survive long enough to run massive simulations, and C. that we are almost certainly not in one. At least one of these must give. Which one gives is exactly what is unsettled. For the off-day question, the argument is less interesting as a metaphysical claim than as a reminder. Whatever you take reality to be, the felt rendered quality of certain mornings is not in itself evidence that you are in a simulation. It is evidence that perception has a constructed quality you usually do not notice, and that on rare days the construction is faintly visible. You have been in something built all along. Whether what built it is biology, physics, or something else entirely, the building has always been happening behind the curtain. The simulation argument, taken seriously and not crudely, is one more reminder that our confidence about what is fundamental and what is derived may be misplaced. That much, at least, the off-day already half suggests on its own. Solipsism is the view that only one's own mind is certain to exist. Everything else, the room, the body, other people, the past, could in principle be a feature of one's own consciousness rather than something independent of it. It is the philosophical position almost no one holds and almost no one can refute. The peculiar combination is what makes it interesting. The standard reactions to solipsism are well rehearsed. It is dismissed as obviously absurd, as practically irrelevant, as a sophomoric exercise that mature minds outgrow. None of these dismissals actually address the argument. They address the embarrassment of taking it seriously. The argument itself, examined carefully, is not absurd. It is unanswerable, which is a different thing. The unanswerability follows from a basic feature of conscious experience. Everything you know about the external world, you know through your own experience. Every piece of evidence you might marshal for the existence of other minds, the behavior of other people, the apparent consistency of the world, the reports of friends and scientists, the testimony of history, reaches you through your own consciousness. You cannot step outside your own experience to verify that it corresponds to anything outside itself. The verification would have to be done from inside the very experience you were trying to verify. This is not a defect in our knowledge. It is a structural feature of how knowledge works. There is no view from nowhere available to a conscious creature. The view is always from somewhere, and the somewhere is always inside. What this means is that solipsism cannot be refuted in the strict logical sense. It can only be set aside on practical grounds, because acting as if other minds exist works overwhelmingly better than acting as if they do not, and because the alternative is unworkable. We outgrow solipsism not by defeating it, but by ceasing to take it as a live option. The question stops feeling pressing, even though nothing about its logical status has changed. On most days this works. On off days it can falter, and the faltering is one of the more uncomfortable forms the off feeling takes. There is a particular variant of the experience in which other people, including those closest to you, seem briefly unreachable. Not absent, not strange, just slightly walled off, as if the channel of mutual presence were less open than usual. You can speak with them, they can speak with you, the communication functions, but the felt sense of meeting another mind is thinned. This variant, when it comes, often produces a flicker of solipsistic vertigo, not the conviction that other minds do not exist, just the brief unwelcome awareness that the conviction they do exist is, on close inspection, less ironclad than ordinary life makes it feel. The wall between you and other consciousness is something you cross every day on a faith you do not normally have to articulate. On certain mornings the faith is asked to articulate itself and finds that it cannot quite. This is not a problem to solve, it is a problem to sit with. The discomfort is not a sign that something has gone wrong with your reasoning. It is a sign that you are noticing something that was always true, and that ordinary life is structured to keep you from noticing. Mature engagement with the question does not consist in defeating it. It consists in acknowledging that it cannot be defeated and proceeding anyway, on the working assumption that other minds are real, while admitting that the working assumption is exactly that, working, and an assumption, and not a proof. There is a way in which sitting with this, briefly, on an off day, can deepen rather than damage one's relation to other people. The recognition that their presence is not given, that the experience of meeting them is something one's own mind helps produce, and that one cannot finally verify the meeting from outside, has, at least sometimes, made people pay closer attention to others rather than less. The faith is more deliberate when it knows it is faith. We do not get to outrun this question. We only get to live alongside it. We have spent most of this chapter examining the off feeling as a perceptual phenomenon, a thinning of the realness signal, a widening of the prediction gap, a metacognitive flag raised over otherwise ordinary perception. There is one possibility, harder to look at directly, that we have not yet entertained. What if the off feeling is not always a malfunction at all? What if, on some days, it is a more accurate reading of the situation than the smooth feeling that ordinarily replaces it? A smooth feeling, after all, is not free. It is produced by a system that has good reasons to produce it. The reasons we examined earlier, having to do with metabolic cost and behavioral efficiency. A creature that felt the strangeness of existing every moment would not function well. The strangeness is suppressed because suppressing it is useful, not because it is false. This is a possibility that some philosophers and contemplatives, working from very different starting points, have circled toward. It is the possibility that ordinary consciousness, far from being a clear window on reality, is more like a calmed and trained version of an underlying state that would be considerably stranger if encountered directly. The training is excellent, the calming is effective, they allow you to live your life, but what they smooth over may be more interesting than what they leave intact. If something like this is right, then the off day is not a glitch in a working system. It is a moment when the smoothing process is running with slightly less than its usual force, and the underlying texture, the actual strangeness of being a conscious organism in a universe whose nature remains unsettled, becomes faintly perceptible. This is uncomfortable to consider because it inverts the natural assumption. We tend to assume that ordinary perception is the truthful state and the off feeling is the distortion. The possibility we are now considering is the opposite, that ordinary perception is the workable distortion and the off feeling is, very partially, the truth showing through. Not the full truth. There is no reason to think any human state delivers full truth, but a thinner layer of the construction, briefly, is no longer hiding the strangeness underneath. It is important to be careful here. The claim is not that off days reveal mystical truths or that altered states are necessarily more accurate than ordinary ones. Many altered states are clearly less accurate. They involve distortions that can be empirically measured against reality and shown to be wrong. The point is more specific. The realness signal we examined earlier, the smooth feeling of the world being unproblematic and given, is itself a constructed feature. Its absence does not automatically mean inaccuracy. Sometimes its absence may mean that one of perception's quieter features, the constructedness of the rest of perception, has briefly come into view. This does not make off days metaphysically privileged. It does make them informationally rich. They are moments when the system is briefly operating at a different setting, and the report from that different setting may include some things the standard setting was filtering out. What you do with that information is a separate question. We are going to spend the rest of the script asking it carefully, but we will not be asking it on the assumption that the off feeling is something to be dispelled or fixed. We will be asking it on the assumption that the off feeling, like a faint instrument reading from a system that almost never reports, deserves to be examined before it is dismissed. The chapter that follows opens onto wider territory. The questions get larger. The connections begin to cross between mind and world in ways that are not always comfortable. None of it is reassurance. Some of it is something better than reassurance, which is a slightly truer picture of what the situation actually is. The minute that ends a long, dull meeting is not the same length as the minute in which a child runs into traffic. Both are 60 seconds by the clock. Neither is 60 seconds by the watcher. The discrepancy is so familiar it barely registers, and yet it conceals one of the more peculiar facts about consciousness. Time, as you experience it, is not a container in which events occur. It is a parameter the brain produces, calibrated to circumstance, and capable of stretching or compressing depending on what the moment demands. David Eagleman has spent a long career on the experimental side of this. In one set of studies, he attempted to test whether time slows during life-threatening events in any objective sense, whether the eyes, for instance, take in more visual information per second under terror. The experimental setup involved volunteers in freefall from significant heights, wearing devices that flashed numbers too fast to read at ordinary speeds. The volunteers reported predictably that the fall had felt long. They were then tested to see whether they could read the rapid numbers during the fall. They could not. The subjective stretching of time, in other words, was not because more was being perceived. It was being constructed retrospectively, in memory, by a brain that had laid down dense traces during a high arousal moment and then misread the density as duration. That last finding is worth pausing on. A great deal of what you experience as the duration of a stretch of time is not a real-time measurement. It is a post-processing inference. Periods rich with novelty and emotion produce dense memory traces and, on later reflection, feel longer than they were. Periods of routine produce sparse traces and feel shorter. This is why the year you moved cities or fell in love feels like more time than the year you commuted to the same job. It is not that those years were longer, it is that your brain produced more material during them and is reading the extra material as extra time. The strangeness goes further. Even within a present moment, the felt thickness of time, what philosophers sometimes call the specious present, the small window of nowness in which experience occurs, is not fixed. It varies with attention, with arousal, with neurological state, with the pace of incoming sensory information. Some experimental work suggests that the present moment, as consciously experienced, is somewhere between 2 and 3 seconds wide. Other work suggests it is shorter. Still other work suggests that talking about a single width is a category error because different sensory modalities have different temporal integration windows that the brain stitches together into a unified experience that is itself a kind of fiction. Physics has its own difficulties with time, and they are not the same as the brain's. In general relativity, time is a coordinate that varies with reference frame. There is no universal now spanning the universe. In some interpretations of physics, the apparent flow of time is itself an illusion, and what exists is a four-dimensional block in which past, present, and future are equally real. Most physicists working today do not commit strongly to one position on this. The relevant point is that physics and phenomenology disagree about what time is, and the disagreement has not been resolved. On an off day, the brain's time machinery sometimes runs slightly differently. The minutes can feel longer or shorter, or stretched in a way that does not match the clock, and does not match the felt density of what is happening in them. People often describe this as time feeling wrong without being able to specify how. The specificity is hard to find because the time system is not one system. It is several, loosely coordinated, normally producing a single coherent experience and occasionally not. The deeper question is what time is when it is not being experienced. The answer is not clear. The brain produces a particular experience of duration, and this experience is so constant that we treat it as a feature of the world. It may be partly a feature of the world. It may be largely a feature of us. The distinction is not currently settled, and it bears in its own way on the off day. When the time machinery slips, the world feels different, but the world has not become different. Only the parameter has changed. You know where you end. The hand on the table is yours. The cup it holds is not. The line between them is so obvious that it seems to require no machinery to produce, and yet machinery is exactly what produces it. And that machinery is a great deal more porous than introspection suggests. The rubber hand illusion is the cleanest demonstration. A volunteer sits with one of their hands hidden behind a screen, while a rubber hand is placed in view in roughly the position the real hand would be. An experimenter strokes the rubber hand and the hidden real hand at the same time, with the same rhythm. Within a minute or two, most people begin to feel that the rubber hand is, in some sense, theirs. Touch the rubber hand suddenly, threaten it with a needle, and they flinch. The body schema, the brain's map of where the body ends, has been quietly extended to include an object made of latex. This is not a parlor trick. It points at something fundamental. The boundary of the self is not anatomical. It is computational. The brain is constantly running a small inference about which inputs belong to me and which do not, and the inference uses ordinary correlational logic. If something I see being touched matches something I feel being touched, the brain concludes that the seen thing is part of me. The conclusion is fast, automatic, and not consulted with any higher reasoning. Variants of the experiment have shown that the same machinery can be extended to entire bodies, to virtual avatars, to spatial locations in front of one's actual position. People can be made to feel they are inhabiting a mannequin's body, viewing themselves from the outside, occupying a space they are not in. The body schema is plastic on a scale that ordinary life never tests. What this means for the off day is more subtle than parlor demonstrations. It means that the felt sense of being in a body, located precisely here, with these edges and not other edges, is something the brain produces continuously, using inputs that can vary. On a day when those inputs are slightly altered by fatigue, by interoceptive noise, by emotional state, the felt edges of the self can loosen without any visible change. You do not feel as if you are floating outside yourself. You only feel that the boundary between you and the room is slightly less crisp than usual. The cup the hand holds and the hand itself are still distinguishable, but the distinguishing involves more attentional work than it did yesterday. Some people find this intolerable, others find it interesting. The difference is often less about the experience itself than about the prior story one brings to it. If the felt boundary of the self is taken as a given, then any softening reads as alarm. If the boundary is recognized as a continuously produced inference, the softening reads as one of many variations the inference can take. This connects to the off day in a particular way. The world feels distant on certain mornings, not necessarily because something has gone wrong in perception. Sometimes it is because the boundary that organizes experience into self here and world there has thinned slightly, and the self is sitting closer to the world than usual, without quite knowing how to interpret that proximity. The interpretation defaults to wrongness because the configuration is unfamiliar. It is not in itself wrong, it is only different. There is something almost relieving in this, once it is sat with carefully. The skin is not the edge of you. The edge of you is wherever the brain has lately been computing it to be. Most of the time the computation aligns with the skin. Some of the time it does not. The variation is not failure. It is the system working at a slightly different setting, on a body that does not always need its edges drawn in the same place. A serious working philosopher at a major university can now propose that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of physical reality and not be laughed out of the seminar room. This was not true 40 years ago. The shift is one of the more interesting developments in academic philosophy of mind, and it has happened largely because the alternatives have been struggling. Panpsychism is the view that consciousness, in some basic form, is a pervasive feature of the physical world, rather than something that emerges only in highly organized systems like brains. The crude version, that rocks have rich inner lives, is not what serious panpsychists defend. The more careful version holds that consciousness, at its most fundamental level, may be a basic property that comes in extremely simple forms, and that the rich consciousness of human beings is built up from countless instances of this basic property, combined in particular structural arrangements. Philip Goff has written some of the more accessible recent work on this. David Chalmers, who originally posed the hard problem, has come to take panpsychism seriously as one of the candidate solutions. Galileo's Error, Goff's book, aimed at a general readership, lays out the argument carefully. The argument runs roughly like this: the hard problem of consciousness, the difficulty of explaining how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, is hard precisely because nothing in our current physical descriptions of matter contains anything that would naturally give rise to experience. If consciousness cannot be reduced to physical processes as currently understood, and if it cannot plausibly emerge from purely non-conscious matter, then perhaps consciousness has been, in some basic form, present all along, and the question is not how it appears but how it combines. This last clause introduces what is called the combination problem, which is panpsychism's main internal difficulty. If every fundamental physical entity has some tiny form of consciousness, how do these tiny consciousnesses combine to produce the unified experience of a single conscious mind? Why is your experience right now one experience, rather than billions of micro-experiences associated with each cell or particle? The combination problem is real and unsolved. Panpsychists offer various proposals, none of which is fully satisfying. Critics argue this is decisive. Defenders argue it is no worse than the unsolved problems of competing positions, and that all current views on consciousness face deep difficulties. It is worth being clear that panpsychism does not entail any particular religious or spiritual position. There are theistic panpsychists who find it compatible with traditional notions of a creator, on the view that a universe pervaded by consciousness is more readily understood as the work of a conscious source. There are non-theistic panpsychists who hold the view as a strictly naturalistic proposal about the structure of physical reality, with no further metaphysical commitments. Both versions exist in the current literature, and the view itself is neutral between them. The view also does not enjoy majority support among philosophers of mind. It is taken seriously now in a way it was not, but most working philosophers still hold to some form of physicalism. What has changed is that panpsychism is no longer dismissed without argument. Its defenders include people whose other work is rigorous and respected, and the arguments deserve engagement on their merits. For the off-day question, panpsychism does something useful, even if one does not adopt it. It loosens the grip of the assumption that consciousness must be a recent and rare phenomenon, restricted to brains, and possibly even to a single species. If consciousness might be more pervasive than that, and the question is open, then the human experience of consciousness is one local arrangement of something more general. The off-day on this view would not be a malfunction of a singular phenomenon. It would be a small variation in one local arrangement of a much wider feature of reality. Whether or not panpsychism turns out to be correct, the question it raises is genuinely live. Consciousness's place in the physical world is not settled. The serious people working on this disagree, in good faith, about what the answer might be. Anyone telling you the question has been resolved is not telling you the truth about the field as it currently stands. The off-day does not vote on this question, but on certain mornings, in certain configurations, it can briefly make the question feel less abstract. You become more aware of consciousness as something happening, rather than as the invisible medium in which everything happens. Once that shift takes place, the question of where consciousness sits in the broader picture of physical reality is harder to keep at the philosophical distance one usually keeps it. Why does gravity have the strength it does, and not some other strength? Why does the cosmological constant, the parameter that governs the rate at which the universe's expansion accelerates, take the specific small value it does, when the values it could have taken span an enormous range, almost all of which would have made the universe uninhabitable? Why are the masses of fundamental particles tuned, with what looks like remarkable precision, to permit the existence of stable atoms, stars, chemistry, and ultimately life? These are not rhetorical questions. They are open questions in physics, and they have a name. The fine-tuning problem, the values of certain physical constants appear to fall within narrow ranges that are necessary for any complex structure to form at all. Move them slightly, and you get a universe of fast-expanding hydrogen, or one that recollapses before stars can form, or one in which atoms cannot bind. Whether the apparent tuning is real, what it implies, and how to explain it, are matters of active disagreement among working physicists. Several proposals are on the table. The multiverse hypothesis suggests that there are vast numbers of universes with different parameter values, and we naturally find ourselves in one of the rare ones compatible with our existence. This is a serious proposal, defended on inflationary and string-theoretic grounds, but it is not currently testable in any direct way. The anthropic principle, in its various forms, attempts to formalize the observation that we cannot find ourselves in a universe incompatible with our existence, and uses that constraint to dissolve the apparent surprise of the tuning. Some find this satisfying, others argue that it explains too little, because it does not address why any universe with our parameters should exist at all. A third option, defended by some scientists and philosophers and dismissed by others, is that the tuning genuinely points toward design, that the most natural explanation for parameters that appear chosen is that they were chosen by something. This is not a position one needs to adopt. It is a position one cannot honestly say has been ruled out. The current state of physics does not contain a derivation of why the constants take the values they do, and until such a derivation exists, the question of whether the tuning has an underlying explanation, an anthropic dissolution, or a designed origin remains open. What can be said with confidence is that the universe permits us to exist, that the conditions for our existence appear to occupy a small region of the space of possible physical laws, and that the explanation for this is genuinely unsettled. Anyone offering a confident answer in either direction, that the fine-tuning is decisively explained by the multiverse, or that it decisively proves design, is going beyond what the evidence currently supports. For the off-day, this matters obliquely. The strangeness of waking into a morning that feels rendered or distant can sometimes lead the mind toward larger questions about why there is anything at all, why this particular universe, why these particular parameters. These questions are not silly, they are the questions physics is actually working on. The provisional answers physics has produced are not as final as popular accounts often suggest. A serious mind, awake at 3 in the morning, brushing against the question of why the universe is configured to be habitable, is brushing against a question that the people whose job it is to answer have not yet answered. The honest posture is to hold the question open, not to resolve it in either direction. The physics is unfinished. The philosophy is unfinished. The off-feeling is one small place where the unfinishedness of these questions becomes briefly personal. It is not random that off days are also the days when people find themselves asking questions they normally do not ask. The connection is not mystical. There is, at least tentatively, a mechanism, and it follows from the predictive framework we have been using throughout. On ordinary days, the prediction system is running at full strength. The world is forecast, the corrections are absorbed silently, and the realness signal is delivered without flicker. Underneath this smooth surface, the deep questions are not gone. They are simply being filtered out by the same machinery that filters out all the small mismatches not worth bringing to consciousness. The metaphysical questions that physics and philosophy have been wrestling with for centuries do not fit neatly into the predictive model of any individual day, and the system does the sensible thing. It leaves them off the desktop. On an off day, the filtering is slightly weaker. The realness signal is thinner. The boundary of the self is more porous. The recognition signal flickers, and alongside these specific perceptual changes, something else can happen. Background questions that were always present, always being filtered out, can come a half step closer to consciousness. The questions are not new. They were there yesterday too. What is new is that the filter, on this particular morning, is letting more through than usual. This is one tentative explanation for why off days so often feel philosophical. It is not that the day's strangeness is itself producing deep questions. It is that the day's strangeness corresponds to a state in which deep questions have less competition for attention. The system that ordinarily keeps your mind occupied with the practical surface of the world is running with slightly reduced authority, and the larger questions which never go away become briefly audible. There is a corollary worth noticing. People who deliberately cultivate states in which the predictive filtering is reduced through meditation, through certain contemplative practices, occasionally through other means, often report exactly this feature. The world becomes both more vivid and more strange, and the questions about what reality is, what consciousness is, what the self is, become more present, not less. The off day is, in a sense, an unintentional and milder version of this. You did not seek the state. The state arrived because the system, this morning, is running on slightly different settings. This does not make the off day a window onto truth. The questions that surface are not answered by the surfacing. They are only made more available. What you do with them is a separate matter, and what we will turn to next. The chapter that follows this one moves away from the structural explanations and toward the human posture. How does one sit with questions that do not close, that may never close, and that are unlikely to be resolved within any individual lifetime? The traditions that have engaged with this question, philosophical, contemplative, sometimes literary, have something to say. None of it is reassurance. Some of it is something better. The skill of remaining present to a question without forcing it into an answer is one of the older human achievements, and it turns out to be relevant precisely on the kind of mornings we have been describing. For now, simply notice this. The off day brings the questions closer not because the day knows anything you do not. It brings them closer because the system that usually keeps them at a distance is, on this particular day, doing slightly less of its work. What comes through the gap is information. What you do with the information is the next part of the conversation. You are not a reliable witness to your own thinking. This is one of the better established findings in cognitive psychology, and it is the kind of finding that is easy to nod at and hard to actually take in. Most people, on hearing it, assume it applies more to other people than to themselves. The classic studies are now over 40 years old. Richard Nisbet and Timothy Wilson in 1977 published a paper that has become foundational. They reviewed a body of experimental work in which people were asked to explain why they had made particular choices, formed particular preferences, or behaved in particular ways. The explanations people gave were often plausible, articulate, and confidently held. They were also, in many cases, demonstrably wrong. The actual causes of the choices, established by experimental manipulation, were different from the causes the subjects reported. People had no idea they did not know. The reports felt accurate from the inside. They were not. The phenomenon is now called confabulation in the broad sense, and it has been documented across many domains. People reach for an item from a display and explain their choice with reference to features they did not actually attend to. People form moral judgments quickly and then construct careful reasoning to justify them after the fact. People choose romantic partners, jobs, political positions, and produce stories about why that bear, on close inspection, little relationship to the actual mechanisms involved. This is not a cynical finding. The confabulators are not lying. They genuinely believe their explanations. The point is that introspection, as we usually practice it, is not a direct line to the workings of the mind. It is more like an interpreter working from limited information, generating plausible accounts of why the person it is interpreting did what they did. The interpreter is sometimes right, especially about simple cases. About complex cases, particularly ones involving social or emotional motivations, the interpreter is often guessing, and the guesses feel as confident as the accurate reports. What this means for the off day is small but important. On most days, the introspective interpreter is busy producing a coherent narrative of you, what you want, why you are doing, what you feel and why. The narrative is delivered with authority. You believe it because believing it is the cheapest way to function. On an off day, the interpreter sometimes runs with slightly less confidence, and the narrative becomes thinner. You notice that you do not actually know why you feel slightly off. You notice that the usual stories about your own state are less ready to hand than usual. The interpreter has gone briefly quiet, and the quietness reads as wrongness because the constant low murmur of self-narration is what you usually take to be self-knowledge. There is a small irony in this. The off day is often the rare moment when introspection is more honest, not less. The interpreter is no longer producing confident accounts of why you feel as you do. It is reporting, accurately, that something is unclear. The unclarity is not a failure. It is the first honest readout in a long time. The interpreter on ordinary days is fluent and wrong. The interpreter on an off day is hesitant and closer to right. This is not a comfortable thought, but it is not a destabilizing one either. It only adjusts the meaning of self-knowledge slightly. To know yourself, on this view, is not to have a clear narrative of your own workings. It is to be aware that the narrative is constructed, that the construction can be more or less honest, and that the moments of greater honesty are sometimes the ones in which the usual confident story is unavailable. The off day, in this sense, is one of the more truthful conversations the mind ever has with itself, even though, or perhaps because, it does not arrive in the form of statements. There is a particular kind of report that shows up, with surprising consistency, in two literatures that do not usually speak to each other. One is the literature of contemplative traditions, the writings of Christian mystics, Buddhist meditators, Sufi poets, Hindu philosophers, and others who have spent significant portions of their lives sitting quietly and paying close attention to their own consciousness. The other is the literature of clinical neurology, case studies of patients with specific kinds of brain injury, particularly to regions involved in self-representation and bodily integration. The reports in these two literatures describe something similar, in language that overlaps more than it should if they were describing entirely different things. What both describe, in different idioms, is a phenomenon of self-dissolution. The boundary between what is me and what is not me thins, sometimes nearly to disappearance. The constant low hum of self-reference goes quiet. What remains is something that is harder to name, sometimes called pure awareness, sometimes simply the experience without a clear experiencer. The contemplatives describe this, often, as a culmination, the result of long practice, sometimes accompanied by a sense of profound peace or clarity. The neurological cases describe it, often, as a disturbing alteration following injury, sometimes accompanied by distress, sometimes by an unexpected and confusing tranquility. Jill Bolte Taylor, the neuroanatomist, gave a famous account of her experience during a left hemisphere stroke that included sustained dissolution of the felt sense of self. Other case reports describe similar phenomena in temporal lobe epilepsy, in certain forms of migraine aura, in the recovery phase of severe meditative practice, and in some psychedelic experiences. The phenomenology, across very different causal pathways, has consistent features. What this suggests, tentatively, is that the felt sense of being a separate self is something the brain produces, and that there are many ways for the production to falter or be deliberately reduced. Traditions developed to work with this directly have produced techniques that gradually thin the sense of self over years of practice. Brains that have been damaged in particular ways can have the sense of self thinned without any technique at all. The endpoints of these very different routes share enough features that careful observers have been struck by the convergence. It is important to be honest about what this does and does not show. It does not show that the self is an illusion in any simple sense. The sense of self is functional, useful, and deeply integrated with action and survival. People who experience prolonged self-dissolution often describe profound difficulties returning to ordinary life, even when the experience itself is not distressing. The convergence between mystical and neurological reports does not establish a single mechanism, And serious researchers studying this, Andrew Newberg, Robin Carhart-Harris, others, are careful to frame their findings as suggestive rather than conclusive. What the convergence does suggest is that the felt sense of self is not metaphysically primary. It is a constructed and contingent feature of certain kinds of nervous systems, and it can be reduced, altered, or temporarily set aside through several different routes. This does not tell us what the self ultimately is. It tells us that the self, however ultimate or non-ultimate it turns out to be, is at least in part a process, something the brain does, and that the doing can vary. The off day is, in its mild way, a faint cousin of this. The self is not dissolving on an off day, it is only being produced with slightly less smoothness than usual. But the family resemblance is real. The same machinery that, in extreme states, allows for the dissolution reports of mystics and the dissociation reports of certain patients, is the machinery that, in everyday states, occasionally hums slightly less smoothly and produces the felt-off quality we have been examining. There is something humbling in noticing that the deep practitioners of the world's contemplative traditions and the most carefully studied neurological cases have, between them, traced the contours of a phenomenon that ordinary people brush against on certain mornings without recognizing what they have brushed against. The brushing is small. It is not enlightenment, not pathology. It is perhaps a faint signal from the same territory both groups have explored more thoroughly. What to do with the signal is the question. The traditions have offered answers that range from disciplined practice to surrender to careful inquiry. The neurology has offered descriptions but not, on its own, prescriptions. Between them, the question of how to live well in relation to a self that can be partially seen as constructed is one of the older and more interesting questions human beings have asked. The poet John Keats coined the phrase negative capability in a letter written in 1817 when he was 22 years old. He used it to describe what he took to be a particular gift Shakespeare possessed: the capacity to remain in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. The phrase has stuck, partly because it names something most people find difficult and few people manage well. The temptation, when sitting with an unresolved question, is to close it. The closure can take many forms. One can adopt a confident position prematurely, on partial evidence. One can dismiss the question as malformed. One can defer to authority, accepting a packaged answer rather than holding the question open. All of these are ways of relieving the discomfort of not knowing by replacing the not knowing with something that resembles knowing well enough to function as knowing. They are, in a sense, the opposite of negative capability. They are the irritable reach. What Keats was identifying, and what later thinkers in different traditions have circled in their own ways, is a different posture. To stand inside a question without forcing it closed, to let what is unknown remain genuinely unknown, rather than papering it over with a placeholder belief. To act as one must on working assumptions, while remaining honest about which of one's beliefs are working assumptions and which are something firmer. This is harder than it sounds. The mind has strong drives toward closure. Cognitive psychologists call this need for cognitive closure, and it varies between people, but it is present in everyone to some degree. Closure is metabolically cheaper than uncertainty. A closed belief requires no further attention. An open question demands continued metabolic investment in keeping it open. The off day is a small invitation to practice the posture Keats named, even briefly. The questions that surface on such mornings, what is real? Who am I? Why does any of this feel like anything? Are not questions that will close in the next hour or year or decade. They are not closing within most lifetimes. The mature response is not to force a closure that the evidence does not support. It is to stand, however briefly, inside the openness, and to notice that standing there does not actually destroy you. There is a strange stability available in this. Most people assume that certainty is the stable place, and uncertainty the unstable one. With practice, the relationship inverts. A certainty held against the actual state of the evidence is brittle. It must be defended, reinforced, kept from contact with anything that might challenge it. An openness that knows it is open is, by contrast, surprisingly durable. It does not need to be defended. because it is not claiming more than the evidence supports. It can absorb new information without being threatened by it. It can sit alongside other people's certainties without needing to dismantle them. The skill is rare, partly because it is not taught directly, and partly because it is uncomfortable in its early stages. The discomfort is real. Sitting with unresolved questions feels unpleasant for many people, particularly at first. What changes with practice is not that the questions resolve. What changes is one's relationship to the unresolvedness. The unresolvedness becomes less a wound and more a feature of the territory. One learns to live in territory that does not flatten. The off day, taken seriously rather than dispelled, can be a small lesson in this. The question of why the morning feels off does not need to be solved. It can be noticed, attended to, sat with. The information it contains can be received without the demand that it form itself into a final answer. The mind, given permission to not solve the question, often settles in ways that forced solving does not produce. The kitchen on an ordinary morning. The kettle reaches its threshold and clicks off. The light through the window is the light it always is. The cup is the same cup. The cup's weight is the same weight. The steam rises in the same shape it has risen for years. The day is functioning. Nothing is wrong. And precisely because nothing is wrong, almost none of it is being noticed. This is the cost of a smooth reality, and it is rarely counted. When the prediction system is running at full strength, when the realness signal is firm and the boundary of the self crisp and the recognition signal robust, the world becomes, in a precise sense, transparent. It functions as a medium for action rather than as something present in itself. You move through it, you accomplish things in it, you do not see it. The seeing has been handed over to the machinery, which is doing its job too well to leave any of itself visible. Most of the time, this is what we want. A surgeon needs the operating room to be transparent, so that the surgery can be foregrounded. A driver needs the road to be transparent, so that the destination can be reached. A parent making breakfast for children before school needs the kitchen to be transparent, so that the morning can move. Transparency is the price of efficiency, and efficiency is the price of getting through the day. But transparency has a cost. The cost is that the world, in being so well handled, ceases to register as miraculous. The fact of there being any world at all, the fact of anything appearing in awareness, the fact of one's own existence in a body in a particular morning, none of this is felt. It is processed. The processing is excellent. The feeling has been suppressed because the feeling, every moment, would be unbearable in its sheer presence. The off day in its mildest form is a partial lifting of this suppression. The world becomes briefly less transparent. The kettle is, for a moment, a kettle being seen, not just used. The light through the window is being noticed as light, not just registered as the temporal cue that it is morning. Some people experience this as wrongness. Others, on closer inspection, recognize that it includes a faint quality of presence the smoother day did not have. Grief produces a similar lifting more painfully. After a death, the world is forced into visibility because the predictive model that organized it has fractured. The chair where the person sat is now, suddenly, a chair, in a way it was not before. The morning routines that involved them are now, suddenly, routines, with shapes that hurt because the shapes were never noticed when the routines were being lived. Grief contains, among many other things, an unwilled awakening to the world the person was sharing without seeing. Severe illness can do this. So can certain encounters with awe, with wilderness, with art that catches one off guard. So can prolonged practice in contemplative traditions. So can, occasionally and briefly, the off day. What these states share is a temporary thinning of the smoothing process that ordinarily makes the world disappear into its own usefulness. There is no easy verdict on this. A life of constantly thinned transparency would be unworkable. The transparency exists for good reasons, and most of the time those reasons hold. But a life with no thinning at all, in which the smoothing was so complete that the world never broke through into visibility, would also be a kind of impoverishment. The off day, the grief, the awe, the illness, the long sit, These are the moments when the price the smoothness has been quietly extracting becomes briefly visible, and the world is, for a few hours, not transparent. What this suggests is something not often said about off days. They are not only inconveniences, they are also, in their odd way, gifts, unbidden, sometimes unwelcome, but gifts nonetheless. The world has briefly returned to visibility. The fact that you exist at all in a body, in a morning, encountering anything, has briefly stopped being processed and started being felt. The feeling is uncomfortable because the suppression is what you are used to, but underneath the discomfort, if attended to carefully, there is something else. A small, uncomfortable, quietly precious wakefulness to the actual situation. This does not mean off days should be sought out. The smoothness has its work to do, and so do you. It only means that when an off day arrives, the response other than dispelling it is also available. The day can be sat with rather than fixed. The visibility can be received rather than corrected away. What is being shown on such a morning is not malfunction. It is the world briefly undisguised. After all of this, the question of why some days feel off does not have a final answer. It is not going to. The mechanisms we have examined are real and partial. The deeper questions they brush against, about consciousness, about reality, about the self, are open in ways that no single video and no single lifetime is going to close. What changes, if anything changes, is not that the question is resolved. What can change is the way the question is held. There is a difference between standing inside a question that feels like a wound and standing inside the same question once it has become, over time, more like a feature of the landscape. The question is the same. The relationship has shifted. This is not a trick of psychology or a clever reframing. It is a slow alteration that comes from spending time in the question's territory without forcing the territory to flatten. Most people, when they encounter the off feeling for the first time, want it to stop. The wanting is reasonable. The off feeling is mildly uncomfortable, and the natural response to discomfort is to seek relief. Caffeine, distraction, more sleep, conversation with someone reassuring. These are the ordinary moves, and they often work in the short term. The day passes, the smoothness returns, the question is set aside. The question does not, however, go away. It returns in some form on later mornings, in later years, in later configurations. A life is long enough that the off day will recur, not always for the same reasons, not always with the same texture, but with enough regularity that the practiced response of dispelling it eventually shows its limits. At some point the question is no longer satisfied to be set aside. At some point it asks to be sat with. What sitting with it looks like is not dramatic. It is not a vision quest, not a meditation retreat, not a spiritual conversion. It can be as small as noticing the off feeling, recognizing it as the particular kind of signal it is, and continuing the morning without the demand that the signal be fixed. The kettle still goes on, the day still proceeds. The off feeling is one of many things present in the morning, neither magnified nor pushed away. Over time, this practiced equanimity changes one's relationship to ordinary days as well. The smooth days, the days when the prediction system is running cleanly and the world is transparent, become slightly more visible than they were. Not because the smoothness has thinned, because one has begun to notice that the smoothness is also being produced, also a state, also one configuration among others. The ordinary day stops being a default and becomes one possibility among several. The off day stops being an aberration and becomes another possibility, also among several. This is, in a small way, what the contemplative traditions have meant by various phrases that do not translate well into modern English. It is not transcendence, it is not awakening in the dramatic sense, it is closer to the quieter notion of seeing things as they are, including the constructedness of the seeing. The off day, held this way, is not a problem to be solved. It is a particular configuration of consciousness, on a particular morning, in a particular body, encountering the world from a slightly different angle than usual. It is information. It is also, sometimes, a small gift. What is given on such a morning is not knowledge. What is given is access to a layer of experience that ordinary efficiency keeps below the threshold. The chapter that follows this one will not introduce any new ideas. The ideas have been laid out. What remains is to allow the mind, after this much thinking, to find its way towards something quieter, not a conclusion, just a settling. The thinking has been doing a great deal of work. The body has been here the entire time. There is a weight somewhere that has been pressed into a surface, a mattress, a chair, a couch, and the weight has been there throughout everything that has been said, holding the form of you against the pull of gravity without any particular effort on your part. The body has been managing this, as it manages many things, while the mind has been elsewhere. There is breath. There has been this whole time. It moves slightly in the chest, slightly in the abdomen, drawing air in through the nose or mouth, holding it for the briefest moment, releasing it again. The rate has varied as the ideas have varied. It has not stopped. It will not stop tonight. The breath is older than thought, in any individual life and in the larger sense. The body knew how to do this before there was any self around to notice. The shoulders carry a particular kind of accumulated tension that does not always release on its own. The jaw often holds more than it needs to. The hands rest somewhere, on the body, on a surface, against another part of themselves. None of this needs to be adjusted. It is only worth noticing briefly that the body has been here. The thinking has been intense. The body has been steady. There is a temperature, roughly even across the surface of the skin, slightly cooler at the extremities, slightly warmer in the core. The temperature is a small ongoing achievement of the body. It costs energy to maintain. It is happening tonight without your management. Beneath the surface where you are resting, there is whatever the surface is resting on, a floor, a frame, the structure of the building, the ground beneath that, the rock, the deeper ground, the curve of the earth. There is a particular kind of stability in the fact that the surface holds. The surface holds because of forces that have been holding for longer than human beings have existed. None of this needs your attention to continue. The room has a temperature also. It is a room temperature, not significantly different from the body's temperature, which is part of why the room is comfortable. The air in the room is moving slightly, even if no one has set it in motion. There is a quality of sound, even in a quiet room. The small refrigerator hum, the small pipe creak, the small almost inaudible noise the air itself makes. Nothing needs to be done about any of it. The thinking does not need to stop. It can continue or settle as it will. What is being noticed now is not in opposition to the thinking. It is the place the thinking has been happening all along. The body in a room, breathing, holding heat, supported by a surface, surrounded by air. This was the situation the entire time the larger questions were being examined. The body did not pause for the questions. The body was the place from which the questions were being asked. There is, in this noticing, a particular kind of return, not a return to anything that was lost, a return to what was always present, underneath. The mind, after a great deal of looking outward and inward, sometimes simply notices where it is. Where it is tonight is here, in this body, in this room, on this surface, with this breath. That is enough. There is no need to do anything else with it. The mind that has been thinking can begin to settle into the body that has been waiting. The waiting was patient. The settling can take whatever time it takes. The question of why some days feel off does not need to be answered tonight. It does not need to be answered tomorrow. It is one of the questions that does not close in the way smaller questions close, and the recognition of this is not a defeat. It is closer to a relief. There is a particular weight that comes from holding a question as if it must be solved before sleep is permitted. The weight is unnecessary. The question has been here longer than you have, in one form or another, and it will be here after you have rested. Whatever insight has arrived through this evening does not need to be locked into final form before the night is complete. Insights settle in their own time. They do not always settle in the same configuration in which they first appeared. The off day, whenever it next arrives, will be its own occasion. It will not need to be matched against anything that has been said tonight. It will arrive with its own texture, its own particular thinning, its own particular signal. What has been laid out here is not a key to be applied. It is more like a familiarity, a sense that the territory has shape. When you find yourself in the territory again, the shape will be there, recognized, without needing to be remembered as a list. The questions about consciousness, reality, the self, the structure of perception, these are questions human beings have been holding for a very long time. The holding has not exhausted them. It has instead refined the way they are held. Each generation receives the questions in a slightly different form and passes them on, somewhat more carefully framed, to the next. The work is communal and slow. No individual mind is responsible for completing it, yours included. The question does not need you to finish it tonight. There is a kind of permission in this, not the permission to stop thinking, the permission to think without urgency. The mind that knows it does not need to solve everything before resting, is a mind that can rest more deeply, and resting more deeply is, in turn, what allows the thinking to be sharper later, when the thinking matters again. What is being practiced here, if anything is being practiced, is a quiet trust that the questions are durable. They will be there in the morning, they will be there next week and next year. Their endurance is not a threat. It is, in its way, a kind of company. To live a long life is, in part, to live in continuing relationship with a small set of questions that do not close, and to find that the relationship deepens rather than wearies. The off feeling, whenever it returns, will be one occasion among many in which these questions come a half step closer. The half step is the gift. It does not need to be more than that. It does not need to be turned into doctrine, into certainty, into a resolved position. It can be received and let go, like a piece of weather that passed through the morning. The night is, among other things, an opportunity to lay these questions down for a few hours, not to discard them, only to set them on a surface where they will keep, where they will not get lost, where they will be there in the morning if you want them. The setting down is also part of the relationship. It is the part that says, this matters, but it does not need to be carried right now. So set them down. Let them stay open. Sleep will not close them, and waking will not close them either. But for tonight, the open question can be left to itself, and you can be left to whatever rest is available to you. There is a specific room. It is the one you are actually in, not the room of the morning that felt off, not the kitchen with the kettle, not the philosopher's seminar room, or the laboratory, or the contemplative's cell. The specific room you are inhabiting now, with its particular dimensions, its particular ceiling, its particular sources of soft light or no light. The room has a smell, even if the smell is so familiar you no longer notice it. There is a particular quality of air in this specific space at this specific hour. The temperature is whatever it is, the walls are wherever they are. If your eyes are open, there are surfaces you could see. If your eyes are closed, the surfaces are still there, still arranged in the configuration they have been arranged in. This is not the rendered room of the simulation argument. It is not the constructed room of the predictive model. It is not the dissolved room of mystical report. It is a room. It is the one you are in. Whatever the deeper questions about its ultimate nature, the room is presenting itself, here, at this hour, as it presents itself, neither off nor on, simply this. Outside the room, somewhere not far, there is presumably a street, or a corridor, or another room, or open country. There are presumably other people, in their own rooms, at their own configurations of the same hour. The world continues, mostly without your attention, mostly without anyone's attention to most of it. The unattended to-ness of most of it is one of the world's quieter properties. The clock, if there is one nearby, is doing what clocks do. The night, if it is night, is at whatever stage of itself it is at. The next hour will arrive when the next hour arrives. None of this needs to be tracked carefully. None of it is being asked of you. The body, again, is here. The breath is doing its work. The room is holding its dimensions. Tonight, in this room, on this particular surface, at this particular hour, this is the situation. There is no other situation that needs to be reached. There is no further place the mind has to go. What is sometimes called rest is not the absence of the mind. It is the mind present in a room, no longer reaching beyond the room. The reaching can stop without the mind stopping. The questions can remain open without remaining urgent. The body can be here without being held tightly. The room can be the room without needing to be more than the room. This is the situation. This is simply what is. The off day, if there was one, has long since become this evening. The thinking, if there was thinking, has become this quieter noticing. The room, the body, the breath, the hour, these are sufficient. They have been sufficient the whole time, even when the mind was elsewhere. A long thought does not always end the way it began. It begins with a question, or an observation, or a sense that something is unresolved. It moves through territory. It picks up other thoughts along the way, considers them, sets some down, carries others forward. By the time it nears its end, the original shape has been worn down by the thinking, and what remains is something different. Not an answer, not a conclusion, just the thought completing itself in whatever form it has taken. A thought completes itself when it stops needing to be turned over again. Not because it has been solved, because it has been considered carefully enough this time that further turning would only return what is already there. There is a quietness to that point. The mind sets the thought down, the way the body sets down something it has been carrying, and what comes next is not more thinking, it is something else. The body, the room, the breath, the night. Some thoughts complete themselves in a single sitting, most do not. The ones we have been with tonight are the kind that complete themselves only partially, in any single occasion, and that return on later occasions to be considered again, slightly differently, by a slightly older mind. This is not a failure of the thinking, it is what the thinking is. To return to a question across a life, each time bringing slightly more of yourself to it, is one of the deeper things a long mind does. For tonight, this much is enough. The off-feeling has been examined, the mechanisms beneath it have been laid out, the larger questions it brushes against have been honoured without being forced into closure. The body is here, the room is here, the night, if it is night, is here. What comes next does not need to be thought about. It will arrive on its own. The mind, having done its evening's work, can release its hold and let what comes come. There is a quietness available now, if you would like it. A simple resting against whatever is supporting you, a simple noticing of the breath, a simple presence in this specific space at this specific hour, with whatever is true of this body, this mind, this moment. None of it needs to be more than it is. The thought has completed itself. Not finished. Completed. There is a difference. A finished thought has nothing more to do with itself. A completed thought has simply settled into its present shape and is willing to be returned to later in some other shape, if the time comes. This thought, tonight, is willing to be left where it is, so leave it where it is. Let the body rest against the surface that has been holding it. Let the breath continue as it has been continuing. Let the room be the room. Let the night be the night. Let what is be what is, without needing to be anything else. That finally is all.